Morning everyone. This is going to be a quick video following up on my previous tutorial where I mentioned there's going to be 10 videos that I'm going to look at in a lot more detail. I've sort of mixed up the orders a little bit here, so this one's going to be about kit and the equipment that I use. I think that was number 3, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm going to bring it forward because some of you have said, well, we'd be quite interested in knowing what kit you use, and for those that haven't actually got started yet with watercolour, it seems a useful thing to do given that people are stuck inside. Some people are looking for new activities to do. So let's have a look at kit and talk a little bit about that, but I won't go into it in lots of detail. I'm going to do this in what I consider to be the order of importance to me. Paint is the starting point, then brushes, then finally paper. Paper is your most important piece of kit, I think. And then I'll just finish up with a few of the other bits and pieces that I use when I'm making my paintings. Just to say though, with this particular video, it might be important to quite a few of you, but it shouldn't be that important. The best watercolour painters are not the best watercolour painters because they are using the most expensive kit, but it's because they are practicing the most. Just keep that in mind because it's very easy to get stuck in a little bit of a rut with kit and go, I need to have the most expensive brush, or I need to have the most expensive paints or paper. No, you don't. They're great and they're fantastic to work with, but practice is way more important than the kit that you're using. Paint. Paint comes in 2 different forms really. You have tube paint, which is nice and liquidy and you can squeeze it out onto your palette, or you have a harder version of it, and these are called pans. And this is a full pan. You can get one that's half the size of it called a half pan. I prefer using these tube paints because for me I get access to liquid paint much easier than I do with pans. Pans are dry, I need to agitate the paint a little bit to get some, and of course it's easily done, but it's just not quite as immediate. However, if you're starting off, pans are a good place to start because it's actually easier to control the amount of paint you're picking up on your brush. So it's up to you really. I would recommend, and I like using tubes, and I tend to squeeze out just as much as I'm going to need for a painting into my palette or my paint box here, or use pans. Pans are a nice, neat, clean solution. Either are good. It's up to you, and it's down to personal preference. Generally, with most manufacturers, paint comes in 2 different qualities. You have what are called student quality, where there is just not quite so much concentration of pigment in the blend, or you have artist's quality, where it is more concentrated. The quality of the pigments is slightly higher, and the paints generally are more permanent and light fast, which is ideal if you're a professional artist and you're selling your work, because that's what your customers will demand. Of course, students' quality paints are much cheaper and more accessible, and it's better to use a lot of paint. So you might want to think about them, and you'll be surprised how good they are. The quality now of students' paints relative to artists is, well, the gap has narrowed enormously. And you know, I like using Daler-Rowney's Aquafine range, for instance, which traditionally you would class as a student quality paint. But the quality is superb. The pigments are rich, the paint's very saturated, and it also has fantastic light fast qualities as well. So don't get too hung up about, should I be using students' colours or should I be using artists' colours? All manufacturers make really decent quality paint, and the key is buy the best that you can afford, but don't spend silly amounts of money on it. Okay, so brushes, more important to me than paint, and again, personal preference here is quite important. Some people, for example, like using flat brushes, and others, myself included, prefer using round brushes. Although, to be honest, I do use a combination of the two. This brush is called a hake. It's very, very soft. It's very old, and that helps it to be a bit softer. Is fantastic for putting water down when you're working wet into wet or making glazes. Love it. I've had it for 20 odd years. It's a brilliant brush. These two I use for sometimes wiping out areas or softening edges, although I don't do much of that, to be honest, but they're useful to have. And then pretty much you're into your round brushes. Now, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because if you're not careful, you can end up spending a fortune on these things for very little appreciable difference. These three brushes, in fact, quite a few of these here, are made from Kolinsky sable, which is a natural hair and makes the best quality paintbrushes you can buy. It's just beautiful to paint with because sable brushes hold a tremendous amount of water, more than you can get in a synthetic brush, and they point beautifully, and you can go from making a large shape on the paper to a very, very fine piece of detail, because the brush has the ability to snap back into a nice sharp point. They're fantastic, but they are incredibly expensive. These brushes cost in the neighbourhood of £100 each. It's a huge outlay, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend you do it because it's not necessarily going to make you a better painter. Moving much further down the expense scale, there's a brush that Daler-Rowney does here called their Sapphire range. It's great because it is a mix of sable and synthetic and has very, very similar properties, but it's a fraction of the price. Or you can go to full synthetic, and I actually really like using these because even though they're very, very inexpensive relative to sable brushes, they still hold a really decent amount of water, and they come to a nice point as well. If you're starting off, get these, don't get these. My recommendation would be to start off with 3 brushes. You can go for the whole range if you want, but I start off with a size 12, which allows me to cover nice big areas with plenty of paint, a number 8, which allows me to fill in smaller, maybe more detailed areas, and a rigger brush. This is called a rigger because it was used for painting rigging on paintings of ships many years ago, and it's perfect for putting in little bits of detail here and there. And with those 3 brushes, you will be able to paint small little watercolours or paintings that are on a full imperial size piece of paper. You don't really need any more than that to get started. Paper, the most important piece of kit by a mile. When you get used to a particular surface of paper and its different properties, stick with it. Don't keep trying lots of different ones, because the way that the paint behaves on the paper is something you really need to understand and you really need to get used to. I've come to a point where there are 2 or 3 papers that I use, and I use them for everything, and I know exactly how they're going to behave, and they're perfect for what I need to do. So quickly, paper tends to come in 3 different surfaces for watercolour. You have the smoothest surface, which is called hot press. You have the medium surface, which has a nice texture to it, which is called cold pressed, or not, as it's sometimes referred to. And you have rough paper, which has a rough surface, believe it or not. And each has different properties and are useful for doing different types of painting. I very rarely use hot pressed. I find the surface is too smooth, but of course I can see it's really good for botanical painting or highly detailed work. I use knot, let me find you a knot pad. These are rough, there you go, that's knot. I use a knot surface if I'm doing harbours, boats, cityscapes where there's quite a lot of detail and it just gives a slightly crisper finish to it. It's perfect for that. But I would say for the bulk of my work, I use rough paper, and the surface on rough paper is quite pronounced. There's a very definite tooth across the surface, which is fantastic for capturing textures in landscapes such as broken areas of grass or leaves on trees where you don't want to paint every piece of detail in, but the rough paper helps your brush to bounce across the surface, and I find it fantastic for what I want it to do. There's two different types of paper quality, really. It falls into two groups. First of all, you have wood pulp paper, which is less expensive. It's less robust, but it's still pretty good paper. This is Langton paper made by Daler-Rowney. It's a really good paper, and I used this years ago as I was learning to paint, and I still do. I still use it. It's less expensive than 100% cotton or rag paper, as it's sometimes called, which is made entirely from cotton or rag fibre, and it is a lot. It can take a lot more abuse than wood pulp paper. It's considerably more expensive, but it's great to work on. I tend to use this paper a lot, it's the Langton paper again, but they call it the Prestige, and it just has a different surface quality to it. It takes the paint in a different way to the Langton paper here, and as you begin to become more familiar with watercolour and more experienced in painting, you will see that the paint behaves differently on different types of paper from different qualities to different manufacturers. And it's getting used to the type of paper that suits the style that you want to paint in. The last thing to say about paper is it comes in different weights, mainly £140, which is a nice thick paper. You can get it in £200 weight, which is thicker still and even less prone to cockling when you're working very wet on the paper. And you can actually get £300 paper, which is starting to feel almost like cards, to be honest. But I would say if you're starting off, stick with £140 weight. It is less expensive, obviously, than the heavier papers, and I use it for 75% of what I do. Okay, what other kit do you need? Pallets. Pallets are quite important, more important than some people give them credit for. I like to use this setup that's it's a little bit homemade, to be honest. I bought these two plates from just a homeware shop. I think they cost £3.50 each or something like that. I've glued them down onto this board, and they're brilliant because they allow me to have a lot of space for mixing my colours. And while I'm painting, because they're not very well made, there's undulations in them, and the paint sort of runs into different little areas and starts mixing itself. And because I generally only use three colours for most of my paintings, I'm not that worried about it because I'm always mixing these three colours anyway on the paper, in the palette, and it just gives me access to a lot of colour, and I tend to keep warm ones in here and cool ones in here. It's perfect, and I can be painting, and I know that these colours are sort of running together, and each time I put my brush back in, it's slightly different, and it gives your work a lot of visual interest because you're not, even though you might be painting a field or something like that, each time you're picking up a very, very slightly different blend of colours, and it's far better than painting a boring area that all looks the same. A couple of other bits and pieces. This is hugely important. It's one of the most important pieces of kit I've got. As you can see, it's a beautiful baby yellow colour. Or it was when it was, I think it was Heidi's towel when she was born. So I should probably give it a bit more respect than I do. But it is absolutely perfect because when I've washed my brush out, I don't necessarily want to go back into the paint that I've just mixed because I'm going to be diluting it. I know that just running my brush on the towel will take out most of the moisture while still having a wet brush and allow me to crack on with what I'm doing. You can use a paper towel if you want. You could use sort of one of these old, this is rather brittle, but one of these type of sponges as well. They're okay, but for me, this towel, this is perfect. It just takes out the right amount of moisture and then I can go back into my paint and carry on. Finally, do you need an easel? Well, no. In the studio, I like to use this piece of kit, which is a sort of desktop easel. And it adjusts to various heights so I can have the board that I'm painting on at a different angle. It's inexpensive. I think it costs sort of £25, something like that. It's a really, really good piece of kit if you're working from a table. And then you just need a board to put on it. Again, don't spend silly money on this. This is something from the local timber yard. It's a bit of plyboard. And it works perfectly for me to stretch pieces of paper on. And it just sits there, and that's ideal for working in the studio. But an equally good solution is to use a thick book. Where is it? Here it is. The Making of the British Landscape by Nicholas Crane, which is a fantastic book and well worth reading, is also perfect for propping up your board. And you don't need to buy pieces of kit like that. Stick that there, put your board on it, and you've got the angle that you need. It's absolutely perfect. If you're working outdoors, you can put a board on your knees if you're sitting on a bench or chair or something like that, or you can get one of these little brackets here from a supplier's called Ken Bromley. I'll put a link at the bottom of the video so you can see where to get these. But you screw it onto the back of the board and it allows you to mount the board onto a photographic tripod, which are always much more portable, much easier to take outside than some of the big clunky easels that art manufacturers make. The photographic tripod is a really good solution for painting outdoors. Let me just say a little bit about manufacturers. When I started painting, I tried most manufacturers' products, but I seemed to settle on Daler-Rowney for some particular reason. I think it was that I found their products readily available and they always seemed to be competitively priced. And that's what I settled on. It's what I got used to, it's what I practiced with, and that's what you should do too. Give as many different products and manufacturers a try. Don't spend too much money, and then settle on something that you become familiar with, something that works for you. I'm pleased to say that I'm now an ambassador for Daler-Rowney and very happy to talk about and recommend their products. Also for St Cuthbert's Mill, which is a beautiful little paper mill in Somerset. They make amazing papers. You may be familiar with them. Saunders Waterford is perhaps their most popular one. Also Milford. I use those papers in the vast majority of my paintings. Absolutely wonderful surfaces to paint on. Have a go with that kit. See how you get on with it. Just remember though, with kit, it is not about how much money you spend on it. You do not need to have the most expensive brushes. You need to practice. If you put in the hard yards practicing, you're going to get results with your watercolour far more than the amount of money that you've spent accumulating enormous amounts of kit. So I hope that all helps and look forward to seeing you next time when we get into some more techniques.